Have you ever just looked at the totally cutthroat economic competition in our world today and thought, is this really just human nature? Are we genuinely biologically hardwired to just fight tooth and nail for wealth? I mean, it's a super common assumption, right? But the history behind how that specific idea became so popular, it is actually mind-blowing. So, to figure out where this whole assumption comes from, we really have to look at social Darwinism. Basically, this was an ideological framework that completely hijacked evolutionary language. It took market competition and translated it into this biological inevitability, which did something incredibly powerful. It legitimized massive, sweeping economic inequality. Suddenly, this huge gap between the ultra-rich and the working poor during the Industrial Revolution wasn't seen as a societal problem that we needed to fix. No, it was framed as a totally natural, unchangeable biological outcome.
Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are exploring a really profound, history-altering thesis. Capitalism did not actually follow Darwin. Instead, we're going to see exactly how evolutionary theory was completely rewritten to justify extreme wealth and social hierarchy. Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start off with the myth of survival, then move into Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, look at engineering the free market, and finally wrap up with the science of cooperation. It's quite the journey from 19th century biology to modern political theory. Okay, let's dive right into part one, the myth of survival. So get this. The actual scientist, Charles Darwin, focused heavily on social instincts, sympathy, and cooperation when he talked about human evolution. In fact, Darwin didn't even coin the famous phrase, survival of the fittest. Actually, it was the philosopher Herbert Spencer who came up with that. And Spencer applied it directly to laissez-faire capitalism, specifically to oppose welfare laws. He basically argued that helping the poor would just delay the natural extinction of the people he deemed genetically unfit. It's honestly wild how fast this scientific theory mutated into capitalist ideology. Just look at the timeline. In 1859, Darwin publishes Origin of Species. Just 5 years later, Spencer's out there coining survival of the fittest. Then Darwin publishes The Descent of Man in 1871, which focuses a lot on social cooperation. But by 1889, industrialist Andrew Carnegie publishes The Gospel of Wealth. These ideas moved straight out of biology books and right into the boardrooms of the Gilded Age, totally bypassing Darwin's actual conclusions. Which brings us to Section 2, Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth. Now, Carnegie is a fascinating case study here. He genuinely believed that massive wealth indicated a kind of biological merit, like a natural aristocrat of talent. But he kind of softened the harshness of pure social Darwinism. He argued that the wealthy entrepreneur had to take on the responsibility of distributing his fortune as trustees of social progress. It's a really interesting paradox, right? Because if wealth means you're biologically the fittest, giving it away might mess with natural selection. So Carnegie resolved this by claiming the rich just had this moral duty to redistribute their wealth philanthropically. But, historians like Catherine Tumber offer a really powerful critique of this whole setup. Sure, Carnegie built all these famous philanthropic libraries, but he did it by squeezing immense value out of his workers, de-skilling their labor and enforcing these grueling 12-hour workdays. The irony here is just massive. If Carnegie had shared his staggering wealth through decent wages and better working conditions, instead of hoarding it to build libraries on his own terms, those working folks might have actually had the means to build their own libraries. And we have to talk about the darker endpoint of this ideology. 64,000. That is the sobering number of Americans subjected to forced sterilization during the peak of the eugenics movement in the 1920s and 30s. When things like poverty, immigration status, or mental illness were viewed through this social Darwinist lens, seen as biological failures rather than social issues, the state intervened in absolutely horrific ways to stop these supposedly unfit from having children. Let's shift gears to Section 3, Engineering the Free Market. So, the economic historian Karl Polanyi pointed out something absolutely fascinating. Creating a supposedly natural or self-regulating market, it actually requires constant, heavy-handed state engineering. To make a market even look natural demands huge political intervention. We're talking about weakening labor unions, privatizing public services, and shifting the tax burden straight from labor to capital. It's an engineered reality, built by legal institutions. It is definitely not a biological inevitability.
To wrap your head around how deeply this ideology was ingrained, we can look at the philosopher Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics. Basically, this is the way modern power operates by managing life processes themselves, using scientific talk about biology to actually govern populations. By framing economic inequality as just a biological fact, it totally hid the political and institutional structures that were actually causing that inequality in the first place. And you can see exactly how this language was weaponized against the working class. When workers tried to form unions, industrialists slapped the label of artificial intervention on it. When they organized strikes, well, that was condemned as impeding natural selection. And socialism? That was dismissed as a dangerous attempt to protect the weak species. The whole vocabulary of evolution became a literal tool to stigmatize and suppress the working class's fight for fairer conditions.
Which brings us to our final section, the science of cooperation.
Let's actually go straight back to the source. Darwin's own writings prove that he heavily championed social solidarity and mutual aid. In The Descent of Man, he explicitly wrote, "The more cooperative, self-sacrificing, and courageous individuals a tribe contained, the more successful it would be." He didn't just see evolution as this ruthless individual competition. He saw it as a complex system where cooperation and solidarity actually gave you massive evolutionary advantages. And modern science, it backs this up 100%. The real mechanisms of evolutionary success include things like kin selection, reciprocal altruism, multi-level selection, and mutual aid. Complex biological systems, literally from tiny microscopic communities all the way up to massive human societies, depend heavily on these intricate networks of mutual support, not just purely competitive domination. The social Darwinists basically took half the picture and completely ignored the rest of the puzzle. So what does this all mean for us? Well, the social Darwinist image of nature as this constant, brutal battlefield of relentless competition is both scientifically outdated and completely misleading. The absolute core takeaway here is that evolutionary success very often emerges not from dominating the people around you, but from cooperating with them. Which leaves us with this final, pretty massive question to think about. If biological evolution actually thrives on cooperation and mutual aid, why on earth do our economic systems demand such ruthless competition? It really might be time we profoundly rethink the seemingly natural rules of our world. Until next time, keep questioning what you're told is just human nature.